It's been nearly a decade since the Paris Agreement, but are we any closer to saving the planet? As climate leaders gather in Brazil for COP30, the reality is grim. Global emissions are still rising, and 2024 was the hottest year on record. The Paris goals are slipping away, so is it too late? Or are powerful forces finally beginning to turn the tide? I'm Einar Tangen, and today's newsmaker is COP30. We're now halfway through the 20-year timeline set by the 2015 Paris Agreement, and the world is nowhere near on track. In fact, global temperatures have already exceeded the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold that scientists said we should ideally avoid. Current projections suggest we're heading for a more than 2.5 degrees Celsius rise by the end of the century. That is a level of warming that could drastically reshape coastlines, collapse entire food systems, and displace hundreds of millions of people. Here's more on the story.
At the start of the 21st century, global efforts to reduce human impacts on the world's climate were a mishmash of separate agreements, vague promises, and ineffective targets. But the 2015 Paris Climate Accords were transformational. They reshaped markets, drove policy changes, and fundamentally shifted political will. For the first time, there were clear goals and mostly agreed upon mandates by almost all countries to keep global temperature rises well under 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees, of pre-industrial levels. Countries set themselves ambitious nationally determined emissions-cutting measures to meet their international obligations, and wealthy countries pledged to assist poorer nations in meeting theirs. But now, as the world passes the halfway mark of the 20-year plan, things are not looking so rosy.
The data is stark. 2025 is on track to rank among the warmest years on record, following 2024, the hottest year ever observed. Each fraction of a degree matters for communities facing floods, droughts, and heat extremes.
Since the start of the Industrial Revolution until now, the USA has been the biggest emitter of climate pollution to date. Currently, China is by far the world's biggest producer of carbon emissions, pumping out over 30% of the world's greenhouse gases. But when it comes to the countries emitting the most carbon dioxide per capita, small oil-rich petrochemical-dependent nations top the list. But at the COP30 climate conference in Belém, Brazil, there were glimmers of hope. Despite big polluting USA having pulled out of the Paris Agreement twice under both Trump presidencies, emissions there are falling, not fast, but measurably. Globally, renewable energy accounts for more than 90% of newly added electric power capacity, up from about 50% in 2015. And while the USA has significantly stepped away from many green investments and development, China has filled the gaps.
China is definitely a leader right now. It is obviously the biggest emitter. It's a very large country, large economy, large population, but they are leading in terms of the energy transition. Most of the cars that people buy in China now are electric cars. Big boom also in terms of solar panels, renewable energy capacity. So I think it's a very good thing that China is leading. Obviously, China needs to do even more.
Last year, China installed 333 gigawatts of solar power, more than the rest of the world combined. And 1/5 of all vehicle sales globally are now electric vehicles.
We're actually in the direction that we established in Paris at a speed that none of us could have predicted. However, the speed of damage and the speed of increase of the dire predictions of science has also multiplied exponentially since Paris.
While the Paris Climate Agreement is having an effect, it isn't having enough of an effect, and there is now virtually no chance of keeping temperature rises below 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Joining me now to debate that and more are from London, the director of 8 Versa, Chris Hocknell, and from Belém, Brazil, the head of climate and energy policy over at WWF International, Fernanda de Carvalho, and from Beijing, senior fellow over at the Taihe Institute, Einar Tangen. Welcome to all of you. Chris, let me begin with you. You think that decarbonization is being driven more by market forces compared to diplomacy. So the question is, I mean, are COP summits, do they risk becoming outdated rituals rather than sort of meaningful leverage points? What's your take?
I think they're essential. I was fortunate enough to go to COP29 in Baku, and I had a very interesting time, and I think it achieved some good things like the Article 6 process around carbon credits and the mechanisms that were finally made more solid. So I think they're absolutely essential, but I think we just need to be realistic about our expectations that they are a talking shop with lots of people from lots of different countries with lots of different interests, and naturally you get out what you would expect under such circumstances.
Okay, that's a fair assessment. Fernanda, let me turn to you. I mean, as someone who's long engaged with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, you heard what Chris said. They're essential, but realistically, they're a talking shop. How do you respond to what Chris has said?
I think the time of politics is a different time. And I think we have achieved some results. Of course, we are not at the speed and the scale that we would need to fight climate change, but we did achieve some results. For example, the change in the energy market with renewables being a reality nowadays has to do with the political signals that a process like this could send. And as I said, we need much more, much faster, much stronger. But there is no option yet to the multilateral process here. So I think that, of course, it can be improved, it can evolve, but this is the process that can send signals to the real economy.
Okay. Einar, let me bring you in the conversation. You just heard what Fernanda said. Renewables is becoming more and more important. I mean, China has said that it really wants to be a leader when it comes to climate policy, yet we've seen that China is continuing to approve the opening of new coal plants. But do you feel that at this particular summit at COP30, because of China's dominance in the solar field, this could be using it as geopolitical leverage?
Yeah, there's a common misunderstanding about what China's doing with its coal plants. What they're doing is they're shutting down highly polluting ones, and they're putting in more effective ones. This is all part of long-term strategy. And if you start looking at the effects, China has been able to actually decrease this year the amount of carbon footprint that it's had, and that if it continues, that puts it way ahead of target. So we'll have to see where that goes. But I mean, in terms of talking the talk, I disagree slightly that this is useless. This is about counting who believes that climate change is an issue. You'll note that Donald Trump of the United States has chosen not to appear. But there are 100 representatives from the U.S. who have come, including 2 sitting governors and 1 former governor, all saying very clearly that they do believe this is an issue. And you have to be counted. Yes, the money is not there, but unless you have some sort of coordinated action, targets made, how are you going to put it all together? There has to be some sort of meeting. I understand that a lot of it is talk shop and that there should be more action. But with the major player in the world, the United States, sitting it out, you have to do the best that you can. Okay.
Chris, I want to get your take on what Einar was saying. I mean, and also I want to sort of follow up with China's position in terms of the renewables expansion in that country being extraordinary. But first, a response to Einar.
Yeah, I think the US absence is a shame. I don't think it makes a huge impact on the potential or likely emissions profiles of the US as such. I think that's kind of baked in with the political situation. But I think the big loss and the hindrance is fundamentally diplomatic. I think it obviously sends a very, very bad signal, and you're going to have a much harder time trying to get the other large actors and players to commit and embed certain requirements and in positions as a collective if you don't have the US there. So it's really not good. But I suppose we are where we are. On the China situation and the deployment of renewables, I think it's genuinely excellent, and I think there's a lot to be celebrated there around the pace of deployment. So the rough number that we often hear is that the deployment this year is more than the rest of the world combined in China. So that's good, but I think it is worth mentioning that I think the drivers of these. This is my opinion from 5,000 miles away, admittedly, is that the drivers really aren't climate-based. It's around air pollution, it's around energy security, and it's about industrial dominance. And also, if you're producing so much of this stuff, it makes total sense to make use of it in your domestic country and in your domestic supply chains and deploy it. So, it is good news, and I think China is probably flattening that curve, and hopefully we might see some trajectory down, but it's a long road ahead.
Chris, how do you think the US or even Europe should actually respond to this?
The Chinese kind of dominance over I think it's a real challenge. I actually think it's one of the it's kind of one of those things that's both good and bad. China can now produce, for example, solar panels at a price that no one really thought was possible 10 years ago, and that's obviously very useful and helps with the feasibility and viability of solar. But when you have a geostrategic and geopolitical rival, as far as China, the US, or potentially Europe is seen in that kind of trifecta, in reality, how much are states going to commit to a supply chain and technologies that are dominated 80-90% by one country? I think we've got to the point now where the saturation, the concentration of the supply chain for renewable technology in China is probably going to be an issue in terms of its deployment. And then I think that probably looks at other technologies like, say, nuclear and nuclear power, which could be more domestic and would obviously add the kind of increased incentive there for countries to pursue a domestic supply chain and a domestic industrial strategy.
Einar, I want to get you back in the conversation and give you a chance to respond to what Chris was saying.
Well, I tend to disagree. I mean, this idea that you want to pay more to transition to renewables is kind of idiotic. The whole point is technology continues to change. It's not only that these panels are cheaper, but they're more efficient. But that is going to continue. If Europe or America or anybody else can do that, that's great. It's not like you're dependent on these solar panels. They're one-off. Many of them are being made overseas now. China is not like the US and Europe in the sense that they like to hoard their IP. They were willing to share it, especially during COVID times. So this kind of idea, us versus them, is kind of nonsense. We're not doing enough. We all admit we're not doing enough to battle climate change. And now you're hearing, well, it's about profits or who's in control. I think that is really missing the point, and that's why you need these meetings to kind of put that silliness aside.
Do you feel that China's sort of green industrial drive could backfire, whether it is economically or geopolitically, seeing that perhaps maybe the rest of the world really isn't aligned?
Well, I don't know what you mean by aligned. I mean, there's a sense that China is producing more efficiently. Yes, that's true. And there's benefits to all of America, Europe, and the entire world. I mean, you're starting to see microgrids, kind of come up on these islands. You saw in Polynesia, or I should say Oceania, that they can save 1/4 of their GDP not having to buy, fossil fuels if they can go to some sort of renewables. And there are these microgrids that, collect the sunlight, which is abundant. They can charge cars, they can charge boats, they can charge, communication systems, and they can allow the people to have what they need and at far less cost. How is this competitive? I would understand if Europe or America were saying, hey, we have something to offer here, but you don't. All you have is this kind of like, oh, well, we should be profiting from this. In terms of whether China can sustain it, these are all private companies. They're battling against each other. It's their profit lines that are going down. So this idea that the Chinese government is subsidizing all this is nonsense. That's a false narrative that continues to be put out by those who are doing nothing.
Okay, Fernanda, let's turn to you. I mean, we said that there are hundreds of leaders in Brazil, but the reality is that the United States is absent from COP30, and China is a bit cautious. Are we seeing a vacuum of sorts, a geopolitical vacuum, sort of come up in the leadership when it comes to the climate crisis? And can countries like Brazil or even the European Union realistically fill it? What's your take?
Well, I thought that, this COP would have a sober tone or even a sadness because of the absence of the United States. And that's not what I see here. I see countries working together to come up with a result and eventually a roadmap to phase out fossil fuels, possibly another one to halt and reverse deforestation. So I think things are advancing. And as you said, China is cautious. We expected some new leadership to emerge. And I see that more from a Brazilian perspective or from a BRICS perspective. The EU, they put out an NDC on the last minute, so that was also a good signal. But we are in difficult geopolitical times, that's for sure, and that affects the rhythm and what this COP can produce. But I'm positively surprised that the world is still committed to the Paris Agreement, and this is very clear on the engagement here on negotiations by various countries. I haven't seen the leadership emerge from other parts of the world yet, as we would wish, but I think things are accommodating in the absence of the United States, which is a big vacuum, unfortunately.
Okay. Let's switch gears here for a second. Fernanda, I want to get your take first. I mean, are current climate finance mechanisms enough to deliver a just energy transition, especially for the global south, or is the entire funding model just broken?
Well, I think we need to fix the funding model. I wouldn't say it's broken, but it's behind what we needed to deliver. From the Baku COP, we left with an unsatisfactory result. 300 billion are way below the needs for climate change. And then from this COP, one of the products that the Azerbaijani and the Brazilian presidency worked on is a roadmap for 1.3 trillion, but it's about mobilizing 1.3 trillion. For sure, we'll need innovative sources of finance because public finance won't do the trick. But we need much more public finance. There are some issues, for example, adaptation and loss and damage that are not for the private sector to deal with. And I think we need to be bold in terms of innovative mechanisms, such as subsidies reform, debt relief mechanisms, also taxing, tax revenue. So I think we need to be more brave in terms of public funding and the sources of public funding that could be mobilized. Of course, the private sector has a role to play in climate finance, but it's not the private sector that's going to sort the climate crisis. We need a basket of mechanisms that I think it's not out there already. Brazil has put out something interesting, the Tropical Forest Fund Forever. So it's a new approach, and we need more and more of this.
Okay. Chris, your thoughts? How do you come up with braver financing models?
I think there needs to be the real incentive. I think one of the problems we have is that, so I spend most of my time working with companies and organizations, and they are naturally different to states and governmental organizations. But fundamentally, policies are quite cheap, and what really matters is there a profit motive? Is there reliable structures, finance mechanisms, and the rule of law, etc., where you can actually get private finance to fund things, R&D, and invest. And I think that's one of the challenges. And we do have to have. I think that it's nice to think that the climate action should happen because it must, but in reality, it's whether it can. And I think it's really about building the right structures. I do think the loss and damage fund is one which comes up over and over and over again, and it's a real shame. It always seems to fall flat. I think it's very, very difficult, and it's an incredibly ambitious undertaking. So it probably needs to be 3 or 4 times bigger than what's currently discussed. But it's hard, and I think without the incentive, I slightly disagree with the previous comment in the sense that it is going to be the private sector which are an enormous player in climate tech, climate solutions, and deployment. Governments can make the rules, but they don't have the capital to deploy. Certainly not in many countries. So the role for the private sector is huge.
Okay, and I just want to get your thoughts on the financing, the opportunities, as well as the problems right now from China's perspective.
Well, I agree with Chris. A lot of it's going to be on the private sector. There has to be some sort of benefit there. But previously we were talking about the fact that China was doing it cheaper, and seemed to be some complaints about that. But at this juncture, you have basically the global South going its own way. They can't rely on the World Bank and IMF. U.S. support is going to be shaky for at least the next 3 years. We don't know what happens after that. So you have the new development bank. You have BRICS coming together saying we're going to have to solve our own problems. And I think regionally, this is going to have to be the only way that can be done, to the extent that there is a public financing push on this. There has to be some way of creating the kind of long-term money which is necessary to see this thing through. So it's a hybrid approach, and that's why I do think this is more than a talk shop, in the sense that countries have to kind of meet and greet and say, okay, are you in? Yes, I'm in. Okay, if you're in, I'm in. I've been involved in many discussions where you have to have this kind of personal touch. And I actually think it's good that Donald Trump isn't there raining down on everyone's parade and making everything awkward. You saw the pictures there. Clearly, people were very enthused. But that, shoulder rubbing, very, very important at a time when, as we've all acknowledged, there are deficits in what needs to be done.
Okay. Fernanda, beyond just pledges, what specific sort of enforceable outcomes would the WWF like to see from this summit? Chris was mentioning at the beginning of our discussion Article 6, something that he worked on carbon markets. Could that be made to work on a more equitable basis?
Well, I think Article 6 discussions are important, and the market has a role to play as long as there are safeguards and it contributes to higher ambition, but it can't be the only mechanism. So I think that what WWF wants to see, and a key deliverable from this COP, could be the roadmap or roadmaps. Currently, there are 7 of them on the text. So we're talking about a roadmap to phase out fossil fuels and a roadmap to halt and reverse deforestation. Those are commitments that were already made in 2023 in the global stocktake, which is part of the Paris Agreement ambition cycle. But we need to make things actionable now. So a roadmap should be something that really says from where we are to where we need to be. Those are the things that we need to do, and with measurable milestones and a way of tracking progress. So that's what we want to see. A roadmap cannot be just another process to talk about things, although we acknowledge the processes are important. But one of the objectives of this COP is also to transition from negotiations to implementation. And what we are talking about and what we would like to see is implementation on all fronts. Phasing out fossil fuels or transitioning away from fossil fuels is 75% of climate change emissions. Halting and reversing deforestation deforestation is basically the other 20%. So if we get those roadmaps which really guide the direction of travel, I think that's going to be major, and we can call this COP a success. But we also want results on finance for sure. We want to see what this roadmap on finance for 1.3 trillion leads us, because as of now it is a report, but it should be actionable. And I should add one last thing, which is adaptation. It's really key that this COP delivers on adaptation finance and the global indicators for adaptation.
Chris, can I get a very quick wrap up from you?
Yes, I think I would just echo the last point about adaptation. I mean, we passed the 1.5 about 10 years ago because the inertia we have, we're certainly heading towards 2.5 degrees. So we need to be talking about a mass adaptation plan.
Okay, and Einar, I give you the last word in terms of China's perspective on COP30.
Okay, this isn't China's perspective, but I want to add something on. Finance is the issue. It's time for the Global South to stop having a resource curse and start turning it into action. And what I mean by that, you have 4 countries that produce 70% of, for instance, coffee. Yet there are 4 companies in US and Europe that control the coffee trade, and when coffee prices go up, farmers are the ones who are made to pay the price. It's time for them to put together something like OPEC for their resources, whether it's iron ore or spices, coffee, you name it. It's time to have the West pay for it if they're not going to actually participate, and to have that change, have money start flowing in so that countries can pay their farmers living wages, and they can deal with the kinds of issues that are necessary for the development and climate change.
Okay. Einar, thank you very much. Fernanda and Chris, thank you for joining us here on the Newsmakers. And thanks for watching. You can follow us on social media and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Ali Janayanar, and we'll see you next time.